Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's another Big Boys Table podcast. This is episode 49. We're going to decide to double down or not. Hi, how's it going, Mesk?
You know, Jerry Wilson has 2 chins and 2 chromosomes. So when he's talking about we doubled it, he means it very literally.
Yeah, that man is. I like the cut of that man's jibs, plural, because he's got 2.
Do you think that his extra chin also has an extra set of teeth?
There's probably some Tony parallel that we could draw to the man who can eat 2 pizzas at once.
Like, that'd be very convenient.
It would be. You don't even have to move him from your thighs like Tony does. It's like a Tony evolved.
Exactly. Perfect conservation of calories.
Yeah, Tony doubled. At that point, just start cooking it into your inside your stomach or something. You know, there are people out there who ferment alcohol in their intestines and get drunk just by that. It's very rare, but it's a real thing. So, just saying.
The science of Tony is deep and long.
Oh, yeah. Mostly wide.
Very wide. That's why he lives in the White House.
So now we're going to be talking about sort of a follow-up to a point that we raised a couple podcasts ago. We talked about how younger developers or people who are just less learned than others, less educated, less experienced, they'll come into something and they'll think that they should be expected to make a ton of progress immediately in an environment that they maybe have never experienced any analog to before. And certainly an environment that they might not be intimately familiar with the specifics of in that particular case. Like if you've never opened up SEM Draft before, you might be taken aback by how many options are here versus what Star Edit had. If you've never opened up a StarCraft map editor at all, you might be like completely lost. But somewhere down the line, you still end up convincing yourself that if you don't make immediate progress, you're somehow failing and you should potentially just quit and drop it. Because there is some aspect of, specifically of today's culture, but just in general of human nature, I think that if you don't get that immediate sort of return on your time investment and your effort, if you don't get that immediate satisfaction, it's a tough ask to tell people that, hey, you should actually stick with this and maybe you can do something with this. You just need to keep trying. It's very difficult to convince people of that. So if you've already bought into that principle, then you're going to save yourself a lot of headache, basically was our point from before. And now we're going to talk about the other side of that coin. At what point do you stop deciding to continue working on tech demos and basically just, plodding along on your trail, trying to get to a point where you can finish all your various experiments and get to the point where you can really work on a single project from start to finish until it's done? And, what is a process of making that decision to really commit to a specific project? What does that look like? And what kind of things should you be looking out for as a developer for when that will start to become more appealing? That's kind of some of the questions we're posing with this podcast, and hopefully we'll dive into potential answers for them, because some of it is going to be subjective. Some projects you'll just look at and you'll say, wow, I'm really subjectively attached to this project. I really want to finish this project. I want to see it happen. I have my own personal investments into this. But there's going to be a lot of things that are objective about projects in terms of potential that they have. Once you get a proof of concept, that'll tell you a lot about it as well. Like if you can actually play something in it and experience it and see, like, how does it play gameplay wise? What are its strengths and weaknesses? What are some more things that I can improve? And what's the risk assessment look like for solving some of the problems that I'm seeing? And basically, what's the overhead? What's the payoff? You can start to answer a lot more questions in specific the more work that you actually get done on something. And then from there, you can pretty much decide whether or not you're going to continue working on it. But it's, we'll talk about it. We'll get in depth. And that's basically what we're here. So do you have any initial thoughts on this premise? The idea that at some point you got to stop working on just random tech demos and experiments, try to figure out what you can do to get a singular project sort of started and finished in that sense. And what would be the requirements for something like that for you, where it wasn't just a constantly evolving tech demo?
Usually something has to be proven to be very viable. So, let's say in the case of StarCraft 2, technically I had all the building blocks to make, a campaign. But performance was not good. So, eventually I ended up getting the new system, and StarCraft 2's performance is still bad on a fucking Ryzen 7. And then that was the end of all things. That's when I completely dropped it. Because before then I had hung on to it because I thought, well, Blizzard doesn't know how the i7 architecture works and has complained about it in the past. So maybe on a newer, like an AMD processor that literally is like 10 times faster, it might perform well because it's a CPU bound title, but that was not actually the case. So at that case, it was like, well, I have a lot of technical features working, but the actual functionality, like the gameplay part, is not possible. StarCraft 2 just doesn't perform well enough to play as a game with computer AI. I mean, the performance even without AI is already pretty bad, but just the tests was just like, I did like basically a tiered stack of tests. First, like it's a Zerg map that I've talked about repeatedly in the past. We started off with I think like 4 or 5 Zerg opponents, and by the time I had called the project, I had worked it down to a single Zerg opponent, have the map size, manually painted all the pathing. It was still performing just as bad as with everything else. And I'd gone from the whole bully AI design all the way up to the new system, and we did end up recovering an FPS floor of about 40 by removing set stock, but the in combat was still terrible, and there's just no way to fix it. So that was when it was like, well, that's when I made the decision. It's like if I can't play my own fucking project, then what the fuck is the point in working on it? So that is typically one of the main things that will kill a lot of stuff is that if it's like some core thing is not possible, that's what kills it. The opposite is typically when a core thing is found to be actually more successful than predictions. So if I find that something is more successful than I had anticipated, that is usually when I will move forward with something. If I just meet my expectations, then it's usually sort of a dice roll, actually, because my expectations tend to not be really that high. Uh, Things just don't deliver on those expectations. Like I usually expect to be able to at least make AI more functional and more reliable and stuff like that. And most titles have completely hard coded AI, so I usually can't accomplish it. That's the number one killer of projects for sure. But when we go to StarCraft 2, what kept it going, of course, was stuff like the tactical AI. We had a lot of success in making the AI able to function on a large scale. We had the build orders. We had a lot of stuff that you just typically didn't have within the game. So that was what kept it going because I thought, well, maybe there was also a way to solve the performance. But once all avenues had been exhausted and there was literally not a single third party who even knew half as much as what we did, even to this day, that is when the whole thing was discontinued because it's just literally impossible to make that game perform any good. So I'm trying to think of a similar case where the opposite happens. I suppose Age of Wonders 2 was kind of like that because my expectations were a lot lower back in like 2008, 2009. I was successful at getting the AI to do stuff that it normally doesn't do, like build towns in the overworld and stuff like that. So that was one of the big changes where I was like, well, this looks like it might actually be kind of realistic to do. And then we kind of just advanced forward from there. But it got to that stage where I realized that the overworld AI was not really functional or reliable enough to rely on to play like long games were just an absolute slog. So that's how that eventually died as a result. So a lot of stuff circulates AI. Video projects, however, this is when stuff gets a lot more complicated because video projects usually always come down to like a time commitment energy thing. There's a lot more internal delegation about how much time should I invest in something, how heavily should I bother to edit something, because like a lot of people they just stream stuff and then there's someone else who edits it or some cuts of it and that's kind of it. But when I edit a video, I tend to avoid getting really heavy into effects and stuff like that, even though it'd be really nice. Like I don't even know how to make clean looking highlights or anything like that. That's something I don't understand. I've never really looked into because it's always been like, well, I don't really need all this fancy shit to make a fucking video. But now we come to the World of Warcraft series where I have struggled to attempt to restart that like 4 times. With the last time being around January, February, and that's when I actually just discontinued casting entirely, is when I failed to do that. And now in summer, we're looking at June. Um, I've actually canned every single active project that I had considered, or every single to-do project. I'm actually just starting all over from scratch again, and I'm reassessing a lot of stuff. And right now, I'm verifying projects based on a mix of how much time is it going to cost, how much energy is it going to cost, and how much can I get done in a percentage of that in a short amount of time. Because time is sensitive, because most of my time goes to D&D or real life work right now. So I would like to get stuff done, because getting stuff done feels good. And getting stuff done and feeling good means I'm more likely to be motivated to take on a little bit heavier of a project. So it's the same amount of work in terms of how much time I spend and how much reward I get out of it for taking a small editing project, like hacking up that Dark Souls 3 randomizer run, or taking on a very large project like the Sonic 2006 series, where I'm hacking up, commentating, doing some research, putting in images, and then cross-referring stuff. Ultimately, I can get I get less raw video out of the Sonic 2006 stuff for how much time I spend into it than the Dark Souls 3 stuff, but it's still basically like I spend 5 to 6 hours working, and I'll get 5 minutes of video out of it. It's very, very similar. So if I think, well, if it's going to take me, at this pace I'm going, probably like 3 or 4 years to actually finish Sonic 2006, unless I manage to sink a lot of time into it, I'm not going to have a completed project for a long time. And I've got about, I don't even remember, 6, 7, 8 segments of Sonic 2006 done. And they are most certainly like the best videos I have ever created, alongside the Skyrim series and some of the World of Warcraft stuff. And, I would like to get them out. It would be great. But at the same time, I don't want to rush it either. So I have to put in that time. So the thing is with Sonic 2006 is you really have to pay attention to what's going on. You can't really multitask with it, because you're watching the images and trying to analyze it. So I say I'll save that kind of work for when I'm really more into it. I want to work on something that is going to have more of an immediate return. And I think this is one of the really big key things that drives me to really commit to a project, is if I can actively engage with returns. So with something like StarCraft, it's really easy because it doesn't take any more than a day or two to slap together a functional map or a basic total conversion with a bunch of changed stats. And from there on, you can work onto stuff like graphics. I think in Armageddon Onslaught, from start to finish with a source graphic, to having it functional within StarCraft with sounds and stuff like that, and fully functional data and all this other shit. I think it took me about 6 to 7 hours of off and on work, while multitasking and talking to people and drinking coffee and stuff like that. So within one day in StarCraft, I could have a completely new unit with all the advanced TypeScript stuff that was typically seen within Armageddon Onslaught from nothing. From nothing. Just having, a base unit, like one of those unused units, and just taking that and turning it into something that the AI can build and attack with and does different stuff and has new assets. So that's actually a very short amount of time. Most people can't work that fast. Of course, at the time, I was the only person doing this kind of stuff, and I had it filed down to a pretty fine art in spite of the limitations of the tools that were available at the time, especially in regards to AI. But that also still makes the project really easy to actively engage, because you're constantly seeing your work actually functional, and you're constantly engaging and improving. And that's an inherently rewarding experience, because your impressions of the project are the most valuable thing of a project, not some third party. It's nice to have people pat your back and stuff like that, but ultimately, how you feel about the project is going to be the thing that makes the project a progress. If it's something you feel like a chore, you're going to be inclined to find excuses not to work on it. This is why, you know, workflow and stuff like that's really important. So that's another factor that will make me consider greenlighting a project. And I'm going to make sure we're not muted right now, because
You're fine.
okay, good, because I would hate to have to repeat this shit. Again, uh
Considering greenlighting a
yeah, so
project, if
yeah.
you get a lot
So
of enjoyment out of it.
yeah, so basically the pipeline's really one of the big things. So obviously it's one thing to have the project being realistic to make. But also, like, say for example, I can say I can make any game on Unreal 4. That's just is possible. There's nothing disputing that. I can make an RTS. I can make something like Homeworld 2 if I wanted to. I can make any of the projects I ever wanted to make throughout my 22 years of making projects. But Is it realistic for me and is the pipeline for me? The answer is unfortunately no, because I don't have the skills necessary. So all that sort of factors into what kind of a project can I make that will be something I can actively engage in. So the action RPG one is something that I worked on last year. And that was something I greenlighted and committed fairly heavily into based on the prospect that after an extensive discussion with HKS and a lot of my own research throughout the years, I had a very good understanding of how to actually build the core gameplay. And then we had core gameplay, but it stopped when I ran into issues with the animations. And that's when that was something I sort of predicted to have issues with. So it wasn't something I felt really bad stopping about. It's still something I hope that we can address later on. But there was unexpected complications like having to use Blender and all this other shit that kind of came up, and then that interrupted the pipeline, that interrupted the workflow. No longer was I working within something that was user friendly. No longer was I working within something that had any kind of quality assurance or testing behind it whatsoever. The fact I had to introduce this clunky piece of shit called a Blender into my pipeline killed basically all of the enjoyment out of actually working with the project. But it was something that I had to do. So this massive disruption to the pipeline, this huge degradation of quality in terms of how I was producing my content, not to mention the fact I had to throw out what little bit of skills I had with 3D graphics from 3ds Max. That's yeah, it was just a really negative experience, and that's what ultimately killed it. So that's the kind of stuff you really want to avoid. So you try to kind of avoid possibilities where that can open up. So pipeline's really important. So again, back to the videos for a second. The reason why I decided to commit to working on something relatively simple and smaller scale, like the Dark Souls 3 randomizer, is because I can get the results of having an encoded video out for comparatively less time investment than Sonic 2006 right now. And that's important because at this point, I have canned innumerable video projects, including my most largest editing project aside from Sonic 2006 being the World of Warcraft series. And of course, all the failed attempts to cast in the past. So I'm not canning Sonic 2006. I'm adjusting my priorities to say, I need to actually feel positive and constructive about something like this to really give it the attention it deserves. Now, unfortunately, my morale is very low because of real life, so I can't actually realistically look forward and say there's going to be a time I actually feel positive about fucking anything. So it's one of those things where it's like, well, I have to try to make progress where I can. I have to try to make use of the time I do have. I have to try to be as constructive as possible and make each minute count, which means scrapping everything and starting over from a small point. So I could be working on Sonic 2006 right now. I could be putting in lots of time into this huge project that I will most certainly enjoy, and everybody else will most certainly enjoy, and it'll be monumental when it's actually finished. But at this point in time, it's not efficient for me to throw myself into it when I'm not going to really gain the benefits I need. I have to think about the long term because it's summer. Summer is a depressing time. Things are going to be rough. You want something that you can finish in the short term that will sort of offset that.
Right. So what you're talking about is
sort of
basically like understanding your own personal limitations or restrictions or emotional, like just the way that you are as an individual, and putting that before the person, like the developer. Like if you can split your priorities or your psyche or your preferences based on what role you're playing, be it just a person, just a human, and then also as a developer, it's like you're putting the human part first. You're putting that in front of the developer part when times are tough, and that's what you need to keep going, generally speaking. It actually reminds, when you said that making every minute count, it directly reminded me of a Jordan Peterson quote, which, if you remember, he was the psychologist who was in the news back in, like, I think 2016 or something, when that trans rights bill was happening, the human rights thing was happening in Canada. And
Isn't he a lol cow?
Yeah. Well, listen, a lot of different people.
I've heard some off things about him.
Yeah, he's not, like, the problem is that generally speaking, and this is just an aside, a lot of people view individuals as like they're either binary, good or bad, basically, like good people or bad
Yeah.
people, or, they don't, it's very rare that you'll find people who will read between the lines, look for nuance, and try to understand when you can take something positive away from somebody and then leave the negative. And like we've both experienced this directly on the other end, where people are just assuming that we're shitting on stuff because we're negative with our criticism, or that we provide criticism at all, as opposed to seeing the value in it, which is just what it is, basically. But so that's basically the side tangent to explain that he's definitely a lot of things to a lot of people, is my best way to answer that. So yes, a lot of people do think that he's quite humorous. But one thing that he said that I still genuinely do believe is that when times are tough and when things are like, you're just in general, even when things are not really that bad, what you're looking to do is make the most out of whatever amount of time you have. Now, for most people, that means like the best day or the best week or the best month. And if you're thinking really large scale, it's even like, how can I have the best year, or the, obviously ultimately leading up to just the best life. But when things are not easy for you to, make modular in that sense and really boil down and try to understand the large scale picture, sometimes you just need to figure out how to have the best hour or the best minute. And that's what that reminded me of, basically, is realizing like there are still things that you yourself can do, that you have agency over, regardless of how bad things feel. And remembering that, like, this is how I can, feel a little bit better right now in a way that's not going to be destructive. It's just not focusing on maybe a project that I as a developer want to produce. It's instead focusing on something that I as an individual can gain value from. And that's sort of what I took away from what you were just talking about at the tail end of your conversation there.
It's about managing expectations, really.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of risk assessment in what you said earlier too. It was like the idea that the first thing that you told me when I threw the floor over to you is you said that you look for AI, but it was specifically looking to see what you can actually do, because your expectation is AI is going to be the most important thing about my project, because that's the most important thing about engagement. And so I'm going to figure out how to make the AI work, and if I can even make the AI work. And that's like what you focused on initially. That's a big deal too, is risk assessment, figuring out how much time is it actually going to be. And it does lead back into, okay, how much work is the AI going to be to make an improved state, to bring it to an improved state before from the vanilla game? And is it even possible? To what extent is it possible? What's the overhead? Just like, how much time is it going to take for me to finish editing this video versus how much time is it going to take for me to, edit a different kind of video, right? So you're kind of gauging different videos instead of different engines or different games or whatever. But it's a similar process where it does funnel down into how long before I have something to engage with. And if that's how you as a developer work, where you really are fueled by engagement, then yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah. It's just fucking lunacy.
Did you get sidetracked by a news post or something?
No, I'm just trying to remember the AI shit. Like,
oh, I see.
The lunacy I've gone through with the AI in StarCraft 2 to try to make it work. It was fucking lunacy. And
that much I can definitely agree with from what I've seen.
Everything is just so, like, everything is really related. But there's like, when I sit down for a project, obviously I haven't worked super heavily, like I haven't really committed heavily to a project for a long time other than the video stuff. But in, like, say, Retribution, I committed to that because I was under the pretense that someone else was actually going to try to help me with character models, which is something I couldn't do. Obviously, that was a huge mistake. But when we go to that point now from, modern day mindset, it's like, why would you do that? That's insane. You can't depend something that important. You can't depend on someone else to fulfill that. You have to be able to do it yourself. And that's what experience tells us. But you wouldn't get to that point if you didn't have the experience to tell you that.
Right.
And obviously, when you're starting off, you don't have that experience. You're not going to be able to properly assess what something is going to end up like. You're not going to be able to properly assess if it's really a smart idea to commit to something or not. You don't know your limits, and you don't know really your expectations until you actually start to explore them.
Right, which is precisely why you're doing all these experiments at first and tech demos and trying to figure out, like, what is your identity as a developer in terms of, like, what does your voice look like? What kind of projects do you want to make versus what kind of projects can you make? And how do you, get from point A to point B in that sense? And yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah, it's it's really important to give yourself the freedom to try to explore your limits. And that's in part what the conceptual builds of stuff to do is to like test the pipeline, see how well it works for you, see if there's other options within it, flail around with things like that. And and then don't be too upset if it doesn't work out. Because obviously in Retribution, I lost a lot of time and a lot of energy to that project. There's all those models that'll never get used for anything. There's all the particle effects and stuff like that that won't ever get used for anything. Sound effects, voice acting, all that stuff. I recovered the script and redid the voice acting and the audiobook and stuff like that. But there was about close to 2 years worth of work into assets, and by years of work, I mean day in, day out, and oftentimes during night. So it was like a full-time job. All that's thrown out. All that's completely gone, and the vast majority of the older work proceeding all the way from 2012 quarter one 2011 all the way back to 2008 2007, all that's pretty much worthless as well. So that was a huge project to commit to and then lose. Obviously, all those StarCraft 2 project stuff as well is a waste of time. Most of that results went into third party work, which to me is a nothing burger. So my results of all that was also a wasted investment. So that was about 6-7 years of off and on experimenting. I would say about several months worth of man hours in total went into the research and development for that, and ultimately didn't go anywhere. There was so much hesitation and sort of pussyfooting around with that, trying to determine, which should be committed to, because everything is always so nebulous. So that's why we kept going from project to project concept, changing a lot of stuff, experimenting with stuff, adjusting the scale of our expectations down and down and down and down until we just eventually erased the whole thing. And with Age of Wonders 2, what ultimately killed that project was actually instability. I think at some point I remember the editor throwing me very obscure and unknown errors, and then the project suddenly became extremely unresponsive and very unstable. And I went through a large amount of time reconstructing the data for that project, and then I had figured out a graphics pipeline for it. And things were looking promising, but at that point, that was when like the AI and stuff like that was really showing how limited it was, and I was like, well, we're never going to get ASM or any reverse engineering for this, so it's time to make the decision whether we actually try to finish this as it is or just call it. And I just called it because you're looking at like another year of labor for something that really wasn't ever going to behave that well to begin with. There's too much that was hard coded to really achieve what I wanted. So we look at let's see what other kind of projects were recent. Well, the D&D stuff I guess sort of counts as well. I commit pretty heavy to that, and a lot of internal projects within that as well sort of face similar things. There's a lot of like when making the assets, for example. I have a process in which I go through. I like full body tokens all have to be transparent. So I have an auditing process where I spend a couple weeks looking for graphics that I will need, gathering assets that I can, and then the actual editing process after that. And there's a lot of assessment that's based on how much time am I going to spend on something and how fast do I need it, and if I want to spend a lot of time, because there's a lot of physical pain involved with using the keyboard and mouse due to arthritis and CTS and just repetitive injury overall. That's starting back in like 2010, and it's quite severe today. So every single thing that I do in terms of manual labor, even if it's just messing around with blueprints in Unreal or whatever, everything has a cost associated with it in terms of comfort and pain. So if I work too hard, I'm actually going to put out my hands for several days where I can't do anything. And that's not good. So I can't work too hard. So I have to really be careful about my time management, even in times where I'm actually really motivated to work, because I will overwork myself very easily. And using a tablet doesn't help for that. It actually makes it worse. I've tried to use the tablet quite a few times for image editing. It's not very good. So when I look at the images, I make an assessment of like I treat them all as sort of individual projects. I think of them as isolated from the project as a whole. That's a process I've sort of done a lot with mods and stuff. In Armageddon Onslaught, I thought of each unit as its own project and its own commitment. So when I would sit down on a unit, I would think of it its own little island. It has its own little assets you need to figure out, obviously the graphics, but also the ice script and stuff like that. and how well the AI uses it. There are things that I would change because the AI doesn't behave very well with it. For example, um, I tried to make something. I tried to make the AI build lurkers out of larva. That did not work. They would not do it. So
Yeah, there's so much hard
that
code for
was
lurkers specifically. I'm not surprised you had the
yeah.
issue.
That was I never tried to do that before. I walked in, I tried to do it. That killed the whole unit concept right off the bat. So that was no good. Um, StarCraft 2 had actually a similar issue. They would not build banelings. Period. Actually, they could not get the AI to spam banelings. It was really weird. It with any of the
That's the
builds of
best
the
unit in
AI
the game too. What
actually.
the fuck?
Yeah, so I was gonna switch those to be larva only, or maybe I did, and then they still had problems. I wasn't really sure about that, but I didn't really have a lot. I didn't really invest a lot of time into it, so there's probably some solution I could have come up with. But yeah, weird shit like that happens. Holy shit, I'm tired.
Well, that Baneling thing is almost a microcosm because it's like, at
Yeah,
what point do you decide? Like, even a microcosm of the whole concept of this episode, deciding whether or not to double down
yeah,
on something is like, if you are treating every individual unit as its own project, then suddenly you start to think, when should I double down on this project that is this
yeah,
unit concept? And when you're working with shit like, a mod for StarCraft 1 or some custom dependencies and data for StarCraft 2 that's interacting with AI in a weird way, like there's so many unknowns that you might not have access to, especially like back in the day of StarCraft 1 modding before we had access to all the reverse engineering stuff. There were so many different things that were going to be problematic from that. So,
yeah,
while the results are not necessarily surprising, it is something that is worth taking a look at now and again, is like reminding yourself as a developer that actually treating every individual aspect, be it a map or a unit, or you could make it as granular as you want, but treating it as an individual project will help you figure out whether or not you want to double down on something. Because at what point do you decide, I'm going to invest a lot of time to try to fix this thing up until it works as well as it can, which would be like you trying to investigate that Baneling issue. And at what point do I just say, fuck it, there's not really much of a point to doing this? There's bigger fish to fry, basically. Like, how do you sort your
yeah,
priorities in that sense? That's a big question that you as a developer have to ask. And in some ways it goes back to the whole idea of when times are rough, or when you've got to manage like how much keyboard usage you have left in your hands that day or whatever. There's all sorts of different things that you've got to weigh and balance. But in a theory, if your hands were good and you felt motivated and things weren't dragging you down externally, there would still be some decision making involved, which would be basically like, what do I actually do with all of this time? How do I do it? How do I focus on what's actually going to be the most important? And I guess that goes back to the risk assessment stuff of like trying to figure out exactly how important certain changes are going to be, how time consuming certain changes are going to be, and trying to marry the two. So it's like, what is the most important and least time consuming change I can do? Maybe that's what I can go to next, or however you want to balance it out, I guess.
yeah. And the thing when you're thinking about committing to a project is you have to think about how many times are you going to face that decision for every single asset, because it consumes time to make those decisions. It can consume a lot of time to just come to a decision of how you're going to manage your priorities when you come to difficult roads like that. So you really want to be as confident as possible when you're moving into a project that you're not going to have so much indecision later down the road. Now with D&D you can't really avoid that because it's so organic. It changes all the time. The demands change all the time. A lot of the time you make a lot of work and then the players decide to do something and your work never even gets used.
Yeah, you've told me that was
Say
like happening all the time, where there was like, maybe, I don't know
yeah.
what statistic it was, but it was like a third or more of the maps that you make are just never seen or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Like there's a lot of shit that just never gets used or whatever. So, but I'm also like insanely picky on top of it. Like I want things to look and sound a really specific way. So I end up facing a lot of issues where I have like a character I need images for. And don't ask me why, but they're called FCs, face claims. And like portraits and stuff like that. So I have a character in my head, and it's like a lot of the time I will look for a portrait and I'll think that can make an interesting character, and I'll grab that. So I have like 20,000 images just for characters. but they're not like specifically like what I want. Like maybe the colors are off, or a lot of the time it's a facial expression that's off. Like I'm really really specific about facial expressions and stuff like that, and really nuanced details. Even though the portrait shown on the screen is 70 by 70 or 160 by 160 downscaled, the expression really carries a lot of weight still, even in the detail, because you're gonna be looking at that for hours. It really conveys a lot. So I get very specific and very very anal about stuff like that. So what ends up happening is I'm looking for something, and sometimes sometimes it'll be like a character from a game, like a character from a gacha game, let's say like FGO or something like that. And I usually will refrain from using official art because it's too readily identifiable. I will look for fan art, but I will enter the circle a lot of times where I will end up with 30, 40 images that are sort of like at the quality level I want, but there's some detail about them that I don't like. The angle is off, the facial expressions are different. Like there's always something wrong with one of them that is like I don't really want to use that. And then I will reach the point where there just really isn't that much art, and I have to make a decision about what I'm going to use and what I'm going to edit. So then I constantly shuffle through this stuff and I keep looking for more. And before I know it, a week has passed where I have tried to decide on something I'm going to use. Because it takes a long fucking time to sort through this stuff. You were digging through pages upon pages upon pages of Germans uploading pony images, unrelated search results because AI driven shit just doesn't fucking work, and terrible tagging practices on image rehosting websites, low quality re-uploads. The list goes on. Watermarked images from people re-uploading stuff on DeviantArt. Like that shit's fucking insane.
Classic.
So, you also think about, is this an image I want to make a transparent avatar for? Typically, if they have a white background to them, I'm going to edit them to be transparent or have a black background, because white contrasts really, really, really badly, especially in a small image. Sometimes they have watermarks on them I have to remove. And all this is within my skill to do, but then we enter the stage where I've shown you guys a couple images of JPEG compression, where someone has taken a quality 0 JPEG and then saved it again as a quality 0 JPEG and then saved it as a WebP. So you've got your chroma subsampling tripled down because 3, and then your fucking compression is so bad that here, I'll find these fucking images again to show you. These aren't portraits, but they are still very much the same fucking idea, where it's like, you got to make a decision. Like, this is a graphic I want to use, and it's going to consume a lot of my time on how to edit, uh, just because of how low quality the fucking image is. And, it gets to the point where you actually have to reconstruct portions of the fucking image. And then that is really time consuming. So, you got to make a decision of like, is this something I need done right away? Do I have time to make a decision? Or should I just get started on this huge work right now and make as much as possible? So, if you enter that situation where you have to make that decision, you're going to start thinking, well, maybe I can just find something that's a lot less painful to edit. Maybe I'll just find something that's less work. But even if you do find that, you can spend, in my case, I've spent up to months searching before I found something that turned out better. Or I settled on something, edited it, and then 5 months later I found something that was better right before I needed it. And I was like, fuck, all this time I wasted on something. So, because of the organic nature of this, you just can't really, you don't want to be in that situation where you're constantly having to fight decisions. You want to be confident that you're going to make a decision, you're going to stick with it, and you're not going to be stuck second guessing. So then sometimes I also enter the problem where some images I find they could be useful as portrait art, but they're a little too lewd or they're too suggestive. And, for some characters, that's okay. I don't mind. I'm not some fucking, um, I'm not like a fucking
Prude.
SJW or a boomer or something like that who's going to be, yeah, prude, who's going to be upset by that kind of stuff. But at the same time, maybe it's something I don't necessarily want associated with the character. Maybe it doesn't fit with the character. But there will be cases where like the facial expressions or stuff like that will be more like what I'm after, or the quality is higher or something like that. And then I face this really unexpected decision where it's like, do I want to use this art or do I not want to use this art? Is this something I can cleverly censor or hide? Is it something I can crop around? And then, or maybe it's cases where I can do that, but I usually also a lot of times people search up sources for art as well. So then I start thinking about, is this something I really care about? Like even just describing this, it consumes a lot of time. And that's like a mental conflict where I face a lot of the time. So over time, it's like I have to get more and more and more decisive about what I'm doing because right now in the game, we're in an area that's very high in content and a very, very high turnover rate of content actually being exposed. Because they're sort of in a maze area where there's lots of different places they can go. There's lots of different characters that they can encounter. So my given workload for a week right now is it slowed down a little bit today and in the last 2 weeks because they kind of got stuck in an area. But before that, it was like I had to make 4 or 5 maps a day, or not a day, but a week. I had to make 2 or 3 characters a week. I usually had to make 2 or 3 full body transparent tokens for unit assets in a day or a week, sometimes in a day. And then I had to actually make stat blocks for all that. All this time I'm searching for music. I have to edit that music so it loops correctly. I have to flesh out these areas. Then I have to actually put this onto the website that is Roll20, which is a huge piece of shit and makes this take a long time. And then I have to trick everything out. I have to populate the maps. I have to design anything that's in them. I have to think about all the gameplay implications because I do all my stat blocks and stuff from scratch. I don't refer to third-party material for this. And I had to design everything, figure out the balance in my head without ever being able to reference anything because you can't tell the players what the fuck you're doing. So I usually need like a long time to think about a unique encounter, something that stands out from the rest of the game, and then actually build the content for it, or know what the encounter is, build the content for it, and hopefully along the way figure out what it's actually going to do when the players encounter it. And then what happens is the players end up doing something completely unexpected. They go into a totally different location. I have to settle that stuff aside, reallocate everything on the spot, and then work on something else the next week. So now I've got like a bunch of half complete work, and I have to then later return to it at a different time. But I can't do it now. I can't finish it now. I have to reallocate everything, do something completely different. So because I'm making all this content or otherwise editing all this content goes through some kind of process before it gets put into the game. There's a lot of times where it's like I have to make a decision, I have to commit to something right away. I don't have much time to second guess myself. I don't have much time to second guess about what content I'm going to put into the project. It needs to be done. I need to come to a decision right away. So what will end up happening now recently, where it's like I find something that fits what I want, I'm just going to use it. I don't care what the fuck the source is, as long as I can either censor it or edit it or crop it in some manner, or otherwise be something I just don't care about. But there'll be cases where it's like I cannot find a source that I want. I talked about this one before, where there was an image I actually had to color and edit myself, and that was something I've literally never done before. But it was the only image I found that was going to fit what I wanted. So I could settle for second best, or I can do something I've never done before and take something that will work and then actually finish it and make it like colored and fleshed out and shaded and stuff like that. So that was where a lot of time went into. And what I ended up doing in that case is I just reallocate my other resources. I decided on the spot, I'm going to commit to this. And I'm going to keep working on it until we find success, and I will not accept failure. There are only a few cases where I'm really, really willing to like set down my foot on stuff like that. But this is such a case where I decided, I've spent however long looking for an image for something like this. I found something that can kind of work for what I want, but I need to put in a lot of time in it. It's better just to sit down and get the fucking work done than to continue to second guess. So that is precisely what I did. And I think it worked for it for about 2 or 3 days nonstop until I started to reach a point where I was actually looking to be pretty confident with it. And you know what? Along the way, I learned a lot of things. It is hard for me to actually find the motivation to do that. I have to get to the point, the perfect mix of sort of frustration and dedication to something where I'm actually really willing to take that huge risk because it could not work out, right? It could not work out. I ran into that with the Unreal 4 project with Blender a lot. And that's one of the reasons why I got so frustrated is because I put so much time into trying to learn how to do stuff in Blender and it just didn't work out every single fucking time. Or I would put a lot of time into figuring out animations and stuff like that and things were just not working out. The whole shared Oh my god, I don't even remember the name of it anymore, and it was just a fucking half year ago. The fuck, I just checking my fucking
Destroyed.
my thing in
Your thing and my thing?
yeah. I'm looking for the name of it. The thing that just retargeting. That's it. Retargeting. That fucking destroyed me. That slew me. You're
What is
supposed to be able to
retargeting?
take a mesh with the similar proportions to another mesh, like say for example, a male soldier and a female soldier, and take animations from one and put them on the other, and it's supposed to just work. It doesn't. It doesn't. It's supposed to be able to handle different skeletal structures. It doesn't. This shit was never actually really tested. People never actually fucking paid attention to doing this. Because the second you try to do something with even slight changes in the skeleton, it freaks the fuck out. You end up with shit displaced everywhere. It's super, super, super fucked. And I spent fucking weeks on this, and HKS spent tons of time on this. We even invested real money into trying to get assets together that could work with this. That's fucking unprecedented for us. But that's how strongly we felt like about getting this done, and literally it was all a waste. So, but we were super fucking committed to that until we basically exhausted every single option that was realistically available to us. And we were super committed to that because, you know, the project other than this stuff was all fucking fleshed out and possible and viable. But now you sit at the end of the day and you think, holy shit, I spent 2 months dawn to dusk working on this project, and now I haven't even touched it since fucking November or December or something like that, and I don't even know when I'm going to touch it again. That means all the time I put into it was a waste. Sure, I learned a lot, but I'm not able to actively use those skills for anything. So that means it's a waste, right? Like a lot of the skills that I picked up from other stuff, like the modeling and stuff like that, it has like small retention where I can use it somewhere else. But for the most part, those skills just end up decaying and they don't get used anymore. Like my voice acting, for example, I haven't really done hardly any voice acting since 2014, and I don't think I ever will again. So that means that all my voice acting prior to that point was effectively a waste, other than what I actively use in either a third party project or what I apply to my casting, like for these podcasts. But you wouldn't know that I did so much training and practice for voice acting and casting and stuff like that since all the way back when I was a fucking toddler using a tape deck. You wouldn't know I had that kind of history because it hasn't really been applied to much. But you know, like that's what happens when you hit a point where you have to kind of like abandon what you're working on because it's not actually possible. And that feels really bad to do. And that's going to make you a lot more harsh in actually committing to something when you could actually realistically commit to it. So, another thing you sort of face when you are deciding if you're going to commit to a project is you look back at your past experiences, and I struggled a lot with this, and you second guess your ability to commit to something because of so many failures in the past. And like the constant failure to do casting really hit a lot. And that's why I don't have the balls to just start and record something these days when I could realistically get something finished. And because so many times I tried to, it didn't work out. But you have to try to distance yourself from that and still try to encapsulate your project and think of it as its own thing, you know, and that can be hard.
Yeah, there's sounds like there's a ton of different like emotional based avenues that you've had to go down to try to figure out like basically reasoning with yourself, almost like negotiating with yourself. What are you willing to do versus what can you do? And I think when you talked earlier about the fact that a lot of that decision, they call it paralysis by analysis, where it actually stops you from being able to progress, or it takes up too much time in some other capacity where the pipeline is now in jeopardy in a different way because you spend so much time considering what your options are and weighing those options. And at some point you do just have to pull the trigger, which I think, you know, kind of wraps up nicely the idea, or doesn't really wrap it up, but comes full circle with what we were talking about earlier. The idea that what you're actually looking to do is decide when to pull the trigger on a project. I think one of the things that I was thinking about when I was doing the intro was just considering the idea that it's probably one of those ever evolving kinds of scenarios where you're constantly checking and rechecking, and every now and then you're reconsidering. And there's going to be stuff that calls it into question in a negative light, where something happens and you're not like it's a setback of some sort, or you realize that there's even more work. And this is where I find it helpful to use the invisible progress bar analogy, where you think you have a visible progress bar, which is what you can see and interact with and what you've been working on actively. And then there's the invisible progress bar, which is your real progress, which is how much progress you've actually made. Because in your head, you think, oh, I'm 20% done, but then there's like 8 million setbacks along the way, or things that are going to curveball you in a different way and make you take a bit more time or explore something else. It might even be a positive thing where you get caught by a bug. You're like, oh yeah, I'm really going to go down this rabbit hole and add this new feature or whatever. Like, sorry, not caught by the bug, bit by the bug. That's the phrase that they use. They say, oh, he's bit by the bug. He really likes this now. He's going down this rabbit hole. He wants to make a lot of voice acting with his projects, or he wants to do a lot of this or that, or he's going to make a side project where he explores this. And that's where that can also be destructive to your project with the, feature creep and stuff like that. So it's not all, neither of these cases are really binary, because sometimes a setback can keep you grounded, or sometimes a time constraint, like you were talking about with D&D, can again keep you grounded and may force you to make a decision in some very strange, but, baffling, but positive ways, in a way that you were talking about, like getting to a point where you're just the right combo of frustrated and dedicated to just learn something new and dive in and do it without really being paralyzed by the analysis there, without allowing yourself the opportunity to second guess whether or not it's the proper strategy to employ. So it's definitely a very multifaceted topic, as pretty much every topic of these podcasts ends up being. It's something that you can dive in and attack from a bunch of different angles. And I think pretty much everybody, even if they haven't fancied themselves a content developer at any capacity, they've probably felt this, because it's just part of the human condition, I think, to be constantly second guessing whether or not you're making the right decisions or anything like that. So it comes as no surprise to me that we're unpacking it in a different way. I do think that the ever-evolving approach is useful, and the invisible progress bar is useful in that sense. These are like basic ideas that you can carry along with you as you're working on your project and slaving away at it and trying to make sure that you're bringing it to life in the proper manner, not just bringing it to life at all, but bringing it to life responsibly in a way that shows that you are disciplined and you are dedicated to a high-quality end result. It's going to take a long time. Being open to the fact that it takes a long time is the first step, really. And once you acknowledge that, understanding that there are going to be points that call into question the legitimacy of the project or the viability of the project, and being open to explore those as sort of like you said, trying to detach your emotions from it and consider your project separate from whatever, misgivings you have for your pipeline or your process, and try to like look at that in an objective sense and see what are the attributes of this flaw or this positive element even, and how can I maximize its positivity and reduce its negativity in terms of the impact it has to the project's development and the project's execution as well, the end result. For example, something that actually popped up today on stream was I was working on some... I think I was like just looking through the new game state documentation to edit something, and I was also looking at this map that I had made a while ago, the very first Terran mission, and I was weighing the idea of whether or not to add a new feature for SCVs that would allow them to reclaim Terran structures. And basically the idea is almost like a conversion from like Age of Empires or something like that, where they channel for a certain amount of time while moving around the structure as if they were building it. And once they finished their channel, they would actually claim control of it. And that speed at which they reclaimed it was determined based on, like, it was going to be half of the build time of the structure. And then if it was reduced in health, that would further reduce the time it took. So if you weakened a structure before trying to reclaim it, that would be something that they could do there. And I haven't really decided if I'm going to include that mechanic yet, but it sounded plausible because there was going to be a lot of pre-placed burning Terran structures that were just owned by neutral player, and they weren't actually going to be user-driven in any capacity. The AI was just going to occasionally use them to infest, and that still provides some engagement for the player because the player can go and destroy them because they are potential assets for the enemy that they can be deprived of. But I thought maybe it would be somewhat cool if you could, research this ability for your SCVs and as a result task them onto these structures to reclaim them and then lift them off and get a free base, or get a bunker somewhere, or some sort of forward base like that. Even if it would be niche in this particular campaign mission, this could also be applied in TVT combat in the later campaign missions, and of course in melee map makers could pre-place Terran structures in that capacity and have them at like half health or 75% health, and that gets you thinking about a bunch of different options, and it makes you think, oh, that's kind of an attractive mechanic to potentially explore and see. It would obviously be niche, but maybe it would be niche in a way that actually adds value to the overall experience. And that's one of those things where, just me talking about it this way, talking it through, is one way that I do try to risk assess something like that and really consider, is it worth trying to add something like that? And we're talking about a game state that's very, very complex. And so far as there's a lot of moving parts compared to the original Brood War, there's a lot of different strategies people can make and implement. And build orders are completely different now, at least for Terrans, and pretty significantly distinct for the other races as well. Just because there's been so many tech tree changes, some cases changes of the existing stuff, some cases additions, brand new stuff that you have to consider. And so at some point you do have to wonder, at what point are we entering feature creep territory, which is my primary concern anytime I get an idea for a new mechanic. For example, there's a corollary for Zerg, where instead of just being able to infest Terran command centers, which is basically a gimmick that's only associated with one unit, I was going to forego the ability to produce units from the structures directly, and instead make it so that they could infest any factory that wasn't Zerg, which maybe I would also allow them to infest other Zerg structures, but it kind of falls apart there on a thematic level. So they could infest Terran and Protoss factories, and those would spread creep and produce larvae, and if there was a nexus or a command center, it would also serve as a resource drop-off point. The idea being they could use this to take over and assimilate the other race's stuff. That would be a much more thematically consistent application of the infestation ability. That would make more sense in general. Wouldn't even require that we add additional unit IDs or create an entire infested sub-faction, which is part of what my mind wanted to do, which I knew was going to be feature creep, and stayed away from the concept on that grounds. And these are different things that you consider. And so if you're making try to make a hard line stance, instead of weighing all this stuff down, on the one side you run the risk of not including a new mechanic or a new unit or whatever new thing you're considering doing, whatever decision you're considering making. If you just decide, no, I'm not going to do that because of feature creep, maybe you deprive yourself of a valuable, if niche, mechanic. And if you decide you are going to do it, then obviously the inverse could also be true, where there's too many valuable, if niche, mechanics that they stop becoming valuable and they just become like bloat that nobody interacts with. And as a result, they don't really justify the man hours that went into creating them. They don't justify their inclusion in a gameplay space in a more objective sense that doesn't have anything to do with the man hours that we were put into their development. It's just one of those things that you have to really weigh and consider when you're figuring all that stuff out. So those are some of my own anecdotes anyway, and obviously I still haven't reached a decision because I didn't say one way or another at the end of either of those two examples whether or not I'd be including them. But I'm much more partial to the idea of trying to stay within the existing bounds of what the mechanics do. Like the infestation thing is a much more basic change than adding an entire new ability and mechanic and developing reads and figuring out how to communicate the gameplay information of how close the structure is to being reclaimed from the SCV, and then trying to get the AI to do stuff like that. Whereas we basically have a functioning framework for not only player but also AI infestation orders. So I don't really need to worry about that. I just need to apply the same rules to a bunch of different structures, and then from those structures say, all right, now here's what you do differently than what you did before. You don't just get an overlay spawned on top of you. You actually, start spreading creep and spawn larvae, and you act as a resource drop-off point still if you already were one before. So inheriting existing values and working within an existing framework, it's a lot less feature creepy from the perspective of development. It's a lot less taxing from the perspective of development. And it's something that builds upon a familiar mechanic that prevents players from assuming that you're just adding shit for the sake of adding shit. It's actually building in the existing mechanic in a way that stops it from being a one-time gimmick that was just grandfathered in because Blizzard did it back in Brood War. And sort of actualizes it in a way that feels much more reasonable for any given mechanic, any given aspect of the game. Feels much more integrated, provides another niche use for queens themselves to be brought to the front line, and of course provides a nice way to then use those structures that you have infested without needing to develop a bunch of gimmick extra units, or even non-gimmicky but very extra units, insofar as you're talking about like at least one unit per structure, and there's at least like 6 different factories you'd have to cover, if not more. So there's a large number of different things that you would have to develop if you wanted to take it a step further conceptually. So keeping things more reasonable in that sense makes a lot more sense just from an argumentative perspective when you're trying to lay it all out. And that's one of those things that I think, without getting lost in the sea of ideas, which I have done in the past, and launching myself at every different idea that I could think of and trying to implement it and deciding, oh, here's what I can do. It's one of those things that without the, like you said, without the failure or without the negative experiences of trying to do something, like relying on somebody else, or which was your case with Black Sun, but also just messing around with a lot of different things that you think are great choices to make, but don't end up adding much. It gives you a sense for what choices are actually good to make in general, in a more broad strokes experience. And then in the more zeroed in experience, or case of mine, it gives you experience that reinforces what decisions or what mechanics are good to add in an RTS or in whatever context you're working with. So I think there's a lot to be taken from just trying stuff out, seeing if it works, and then trying to analyze, like trying to really actualize the learning experience of making a mistake in that sense. And if I end up adding a mechanic or a unit, which I've already done for Hydra, that I've then had to re-engineer in some capacity or outright remove, though I don't think that last part has happened yet, but I have had to re-engineer a lot of stuff and retool some stuff, and there's some more stuff that's still on my list. The unit concepts are really difficult to nail down sometimes, and mechanics even more so, and upgrades even more so sometimes. So you really have to be open to the idea that, okay, some of the stuff isn't going to stick. I need to figure out why it didn't stick. I need to try to learn for the future, but I also need to decide if I'm going to double down on the concept with a new version, or if I'm going to remove it entirely from the game state and find something else to put in its place, if indeed something even needs to be put in its place in the first place. So there's a lot to unpack there, but that's more or less my take on it.
Something I say a lot in D&D stuff is, especially in regards to when we first started way back, is you don't really learn much from success. And
True.
if you happen to accidentally stumble upon the recipe to success, you're more likely to make mistakes as you go on. And you're basically like, you are effectively trying to figure out what the recipe to success actually is. If you just happen to discover it, you are not going to know what the recipe is. It's an accident. It's kind of like Brood War's creation. That was a fluke.
Right.
Nobody within Blizzard understood why Brood War was successful. They didn't look back to it today. Now they're making endless, embarrassing mistakes because they refuse to look back and try to figure out their recipe. It's just their logo at this stage. And for people making projects, it's the same way. If you just happen to stumble upon success, if it's just a fluke, that doesn't teach you anything. You don't learn anything from that. Making mistakes and fucking up is the most important key to success, because that helps you build a formula. When you look back and unit test and analyze why something didn't work out, then you learn bits and pieces and you start building the formula and you know where to improve. Like when I first ran my D&D sessions, I did things in sort of an unusual way because I didn't know how I was going to present information. I had an idea of how to present information, but I decided on the spot I was going to run these test sessions. And the test sessions, I ran them in a very mechanical way, but I didn't have really like a lot of answers for things that were going to happen because I didn't know that stuff was going to happen because I had no idea what the fuck I was going to do. So I fucked up a lot of stuff and did things kind of weirdly. And then some of the first set of players threw a huge, enormous bitch fit because they thought that's how I planned to run the entire thing when it wasn't. It was like, yes, I'm making mistakes and I'm going to figure out how to fix it. And then I fixed it later on, but other people had already thrown a huge bitch fit and raged themselves off the internet. So, and I'm just kind of like shaking my head. And then every single time along the way while I'm running D&D, after every single session, I sit back and I watch the videos that HKS records of them, and I think in my head, so how could this have been done better? How do we improve? Now, some sessions are really, really good. Sometimes we hit things on the head and it feels really good. There's lots of engagement and stuff like that. And I think, yep, that was very successful. So why was it successful? And then I reflect upon things where I felt maybe it was a little slow, or maybe people were a little confused by something, or maybe, they did things that I didn't think that they really should have needed to do. Like, especially like I talked, I think in the last or one of the last podcasts about map reads and stuff like that,
Yes.
and the difficulty with the stuff like that. So that's one of the things that recently I've been addressing a lot in my reviews. Is like, where did it seem like the players knew precisely where to go? Why was that? So that's something I reassess constantly, going back over and over and over and over and over and over, because I just don't really get much engagement from people about this stuff. Because a lot of the times, even if they wanted to engage me, they don't even know how to describe why they have problems with stuff. It's just like, I don't know what is going on. Now, some stuff you're always going to have issues, but it's really ultimately up to me to figure out that secret recipe. Now, a lot of these early maps, the early mechanical maps were successful and nobody ever had issues with them whatsoever. So I just assumed that everybody always understood what was going on. It turns out they didn't. So that was like a real shock, a real surprise, just because people weren't being vocal about stuff. And then when I proposed the question, suddenly it opened up a whole can of worms, and people were like, "Oh yeah, I have confusion about this," and I'm like, "You do? What?" So then I had to step back, start over from scratch in the new light, and constantly reassess, and then constantly re-engage on that question over and over and over and over and over and over again, because I realized, like, again, I had a recipe for success. I didn't know what that recipe was. Turns out it was for really, really specific stuff, really, really specific cases. It wasn't really a recipe for success. It was a fluke. So I had to figure out why that fluke happened and then differ that between the stuff that was not working out. And it's taken quite a few months, ever since Albion. Well, even we had issues back in Albion 1, but the current issues were like months of me looking back and reassessing and adjusting and reflecting and reassessing and adjusting and reflecting. And I try things and it doesn't work out, and it's like, okay, so that idea doesn't work out, and I know there's a solution we can make this work. You just got to figure out how. So again, I try to do it through small adjustments. I figure out what improves readability. I go through all the maps again. We end up playing again. We cycle through the maps again. Figure out, hey, these changes are great, but maybe this didn't work out. Or it's usually a lot of times it's like me trying to pick up on subtleties. Um, it's usually not very obvious, but sometimes it is. Just based on how people move or behave, or they avoid certain areas that I think, maybe they didn't think this was actually accessible, and stuff like that. But that's like one of the most simplest subjects, because it's an asset that you're engaging with. There is more complicated things you have to constantly be concerned about. Things like how people are assimilating certain kinds of information, if they're not getting things that they should be getting, if something is maybe too heavy to get into in terms of how complicated it is, or if the way that information is being presented is making it appear too complicated, or something like that. There's a lot of instances of that. So I'm not a short form writer. I'm absolutely abysmal at spot writing. It is by far my weakest skill overall, and that really has not improved over 3 years of running D&D. If anything, it's gotten harder and harder and harder for me to do it, because I always feel pressured by time. Constantly having to run AFK does not change when I'm in the game, and I'm constantly looking for ways to try to alleviate that responsibility. It's one of the reasons why I really focus a lot on finding the right image and audio assets, because if those can set the mood for me and do the describing of stuff for me, then that saves me a lot of time and stress when I'm actually playing the game. Then I don't have to try to describe everything that's going on. If I can just show you an image and be like, hey, this is what this character looks like, this is what this area looks like, it saves me a lot of time. So there's a lot of like measured risks in that, where like if I rely on a lot of those assets have to be really, really good to get the job done. So that means my prep work, there's a lot of responsibility in that to ensure that we aren't going to have any confusion about something. So when confusion does come up, then, oh, hey, I made a mistake, and it's not the end of the world. I can go back and adjust it, and then I've learned something. I've learned this confusion could happen elsewhere. Maybe it has happened elsewhere, and I don't know about it because nobody told me about it. So now I have to go back and reassess everything. And every time along the way, every now and then, I come across something where it's like, maybe that's why this happened. Maybe that's why people did this here. And it gives me new information to reflect on previous decision making that the players did. And then I educate myself a little bit further. So combat design is another one. because a lot of encounters turned out way easier than I expected for the players. They kind of breeze through a lot of combat. Now that is the nature of something that's driven by random chance. Is sometimes no matter what stats you give something, there's a good chance you're just gonna roll like garbage all the time. And when you factor in action economy of a group of players and maybe allied NPCs versus one unit, balance gets to be extraordinarily difficult to fuck around with. So there was some swings in the initial sessions I ran where some stuff, the stats weren't tuned that well, and they were way too easy. Some of them were a little more threatening than maybe they should have been damage-wise, but they still weren't like really that overbearing. And then I have to constantly reflect on that. And then I tried to like determine why players do stuff, because sometimes players do stuff are really, you just can't really expect they're going to do. Like sometimes players are really willing to blow resources on really unnecessary things,
Yeah.
and it can really warp the difficulty of the entire fucking like series of shit that you have set up. And you start thinking about, the player blew all these resources on this one thing. Like we just had the last session we played, one of the players just blew, like Schwa blew her last, I think it was her last high level spell slot to turn Mucky into an ostrich for not really too much reason. And ultimately what happens is the ostrich ends up biting Schwa's character and dealing like an enormous amount of fucking damage.
Wow.
So Schwa like lost half of her remaining health at that point to Seka poking and swiping at her.
How do you guys
And
handle?
this,
Just a side note, I guess, but how do you guys actually handle when the characters die, or has that even happened yet? Like, how do you
it
resolve
hasn't
that?
happened yet. So normally in D&D at low level, if you die, that's just fucking it, because nobody has spell slots high enough to do resurrection. Now, some settings or some areas, or if the DM's nice, they might give you an option of like a quest or something you can work towards to revive someone. So in Schwa's offline game, one player character did die. They chased a bunch of will-o-wisps that they really shouldn't have chased, and then one of them died. And so they had to pay, I guess, a church or something to revive him, which was all of the gold they had. I don't know what character level they are. I think it's around like 4, 5, 6. So that's quite significant. In my game, I have some custom mechanics for player death, but we've gotten very close to running into player death a few times, but we haven't actually had it yet. Um,
I
the
assume you don't want to
players
go
play.
into like super detail in case they end up like one of your players ends
Yeah,
up
yeah,
looking at
I
this.
definitely can't really go into detail for this stuff, but it's one of those things. Like I'm kind of glad we haven't had to deal with it, at least early on, because I think it can actually kill games when players die, even if there's like a chance later on for them to revive. Because uh, if you end up spending a really, really, really long time where you can't actually play the game, it's going to kill your motivation.
Right.
So the
Kill
other
your
thing is
interest.
that yeah, people tend to get really invested into their characters as well. I've actually had this discussion with someone way back who was running like a multi-year online game, and we were talking about stuff like character death and players, particularly certain players who would get very invested into their characters, because the experience progression was a lot slower than that. That was a D&D world as opposed to my world. In my world, there's a lot of cases where there's like old historic figures and stuff like that being revived from places. There's a lot of different potential mechanics for players to possibly either get revived, like there would be huge penalties for dying, but it's not impossible for them to come back in some form at some point. But in traditional D&D, especially in the setting that this guy's games were in, it really wasn't something that was going to happen anytime soon, at the least. And um, I said something along the lines of, "Well, you know that if so and so's character dies, there's a good chance it's going to unravel the entire game because all the player dynamic is built around this one character. And when that character disappears, even if they make a new character, it's not going to be the same thing. The whole party dynamic changes. The whole thing that really holds the game together, as far as like the character interaction, is going to shift massively. And I have read games where this actually kills the game. There was a forum game where they played for at least a year, and an incident happens that resulted in 2 major player character deaths. And the players went ahead and made new characters, but the game died afterwards anyways because, simply put, the change was too much. So the thing about D&D games and stuff like that is it is very, very, very uncommon for them to actually finish. It is very, very, very uncommon for them to finish. And I don't just mean like the players die and then that's it. I mean, like, it's very uncommon for them to reach a resolution where it's a full TPK or the campaign is actually finished. Because most of the time people lose motivation. And the most disastrous thing for my game would be that people lose motivation. And I can say for certainty that at least 2 of the 4 players will probably never lose motivation. I cannot say for certainty if 2 of the other players will lose motivation or not because I don't know them very well and I don't know the conditions for them to lose motivation. I think it would be extremely testing if their player characters died and they were said they were unable, or said or otherwise, experienced the inability to play for an extended period of time in a game that has been going on for 3 years now, because that would be such a massive change of tempo that, it's something you could engage. Like, they were in several fights in their current area where it came down to just a handful of rolls and decisions if they died or not. Like, the whole fucking party could have died so easily in any one of these fights. There was a fight against it was a very special boss. It was one I didn't expect for them to encounter as early in this maze area as they did, but they did encounter her. And she had let's see, there was the 2 goddesses, there was a nightmare version of the party from the short adventure Albion, level 12 and everything, and so they're higher level than the player characters. They had player character stats. I basically copied their stat blocks and gave them some custom shit. And then there was 2 different versions of their existing party, one of which was lower level, one of which was about the same level and had all custom abilities. And then there was the actual boss herself. So they fought this in waves. So this is like an endurance fight. And particularly when we got to the last 3 phases, because 3 where we went up against the 2 goddesses, there is on paper a chance where if the player party rolls badly, they're going to get spiked by some of these abilities that can do huge amounts of damage or apply a lot of debuffs. Now, in practice, this didn't happen. The 2 goddesses went down very, very easily. One of them actually got held by a spell that the unit can roll twice with advantage on to resist and has a huge modifier to resist. Well, it turns out I rolled 2 1s on that. And that creature was locked for a huge amount of time. And then that creature also failed a constitution save against something that reduces its defense. So they also ended up avoiding all damage from the other mini boss that was a part of that particular phase as well. At the same time, a huge number of attacks went out. They were all missed. So when you look at this stuff on paper, the stats and the difficulty of the encounters I'm throwing at the player party super exceeds lethality. Now, the player party does have a bunch of powerful NPCs with them. Something that was unexpected is they managed to drag one of the mini bosses with them as an ally due to very silly and unforeseen circumstances that led to this. So they have this powerful ally with them. And I wasn't going to nerf this ally as a result of it upsetting the balance because that would feel really stupid. That'd feel pretty lame. Like they worked through the process of getting this character on their side at least temporarily. So I figured, well, okay, they're going to benefit from that. But even in spite of that, they didn't have any of the other advantages that you can get out of this area that I expected them to have at this point in terms of which allies they were going to have or which items they were going to have. And then we reached the Albion party, which is 5 characters, all level 12, all with their full stats and shit, with their items and some custom stuff as well. And they encounter this with very, very low resources. And a lot of them are very wounded as well. So this is a possibility where I thought, we could be looking at people actually dying very easily in this encounter. All the enemy party rolls high, And then the fight starts with one of them critting Bucky's character and instantly dropping her. So there was a point where I thought Schwa's character was also going to die because they were surrounded by fucking raptors. And raptors have something called pack tactics where they have advantage on attacking if there's allies adjacent to their target. And I think Schwa had like 15, 20 health or something like that. Now the Raptors aren't high level, but there was so fucking many of them that I thought we are going to see Schwa get dropped, and then we're going to get those 3 hits because 3 necessary to kill someone on death saves, and then that is going to be it. They're going to have to figure out how to revive Schwa's character or some shit, which Schwa is the fucking healer. Schwa is the one who does reviving. If her character dies, it becomes massively more difficult to find a resolution for that. Well, as it turns out, um, because of a buff that Schwa's character had that reduces damage by a flat amount, most of the Raptor's attacks hit. They just don't do hardly any fucking damage, or their damage is entirely fucking nullified. So,
A lot
like,
of luck.
that was one of those. Yeah, that was one of those times where I thought, like I was asked actually about this before by someone unrelated. There's a lot of DMs who will make stuff easier or more difficult just on the spot for the players if they think something, bad is going to happen or whatever. And I don't really do that. Like when the game started, I sort of balanced things intentionally a little bit easier because I didn't know what I was doing. And I didn't want to accidentally hand the party something that was actually like going to kill them in a way that felt really unfair. But especially in this particular area, I have just been setting stuff up according to my numbers, and I just say if the party chooses to engage this, and if something bad happens, then that's the decisions that they've made. That's the risk they've taken. Right now, the party is where we're at right now is the party decided to attack a gunship. They forced their way past a bunch of other encounters. They snuck their way past one. They stepped around another, just ignoring all this nasty shit that's behind them. And they walk into the hangar. They're kind of low on resources. Some of them are kind of wounded. And they've decided to just force this gunship encounter. And of course, what happens is the encounter rolls a fucking 20. So the gunship spawns the second they enter the room. The gunship has no modifier on its initiative. It gets first initiative, other than one of the NPCs. And now what we're looking at right now is a lot of the party is at half health or below health. They're on fucking fire. They have barely done a quarter health of damage to this fucking gunship. They've destroyed some of the guns on it, but it's still got over 10 guns on it. It's firing like 2 to 3 to 4 times every single fucking time somebody does something. They're taking a lot of damage. Now, they have a lot of consumables on them, but there is a good chance that before they drop this thing, it's going to drop a lot of them. And then I'm going to roll another encounter roll. And because this thing's going to fucking explode when it goes up. And there could be a lot of shit to come from that. I've rolled resolutions off screen. There could be shit to come of that. Like, we're in a situation where the players have forced something really, really dangerous again, and I'm not going to make it easier on them. And yeah, people can die. And, they make decisions based on that. And I think that in some respects that they might have feel emboldened by the fact they've gone through a lot of these encounters and gotten off very lucky, or they've managed to trivialize certain things or whatever. And in some cases, like, character death can actually advance stuff. But in other cases, like, we have gone 3 years without a player character actually dying yet. We've gotten super, super, super close several times. Maybe if something like that happens, it can actually be kind of interesting to explore. So if that happens, then I will probably take it very slow, and I'll determine, what the players attempt to do. And if they try to probe really hard for a way to figure out how to resolve it outside of their abilities, then we can see, one of the things I do in this game is I try to reward creativity. That's something I've really emphasized a lot, especially within the last year and a half, is I try to determine what are the players doing? What are they trying to think? I try to reward creativity. So in some cases with the way that stuff is typically written for games, whether it's a digital game like StarCraft or a game like D&D, is usually there's an answer for something, right? Like, you think about objective based stuff like Brood War missions, where you defend for 30 fucking minutes, you destroy the enemy's hero
Gross.
or whatever. Like there's always that one solution that it's like you just get to that and the mission ends.
Yeah, very
But
clear cut objectives, very clear cut end state for the mission or whatever.
yeah, so obviously, when we build stuff with AI centric build and destroy design, we're already experiencing that creativity arm because now we're saying, hey, now we're playing an RTS. RTS is about exploration, it's about adapting, it's about creativity in many respects. But D&D is typically very objective oriented. It's usually about like, okay, so you got to defeat the big bad, but in order to defeat the big bad, you need the Holy Hell Hope Sword. In order to get the Holy Hell Hope Sword, you have to go to the Cave of Trials. In order to get the Cave of Trials, you have to go to the chieftain and find and seduce and impregnate his daughter to become chief yourself in the future, and actually have the key to open the door to the Cave of Trials and defeat the dragon guarding the Holy Hell Hope Sword. Blah 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 blah. Now, some of my stuff is sort of like sub-objective oriented, where I have stuff that's not proclaimed to the players, but ultimately results in resolutions if they accomplish it, where it's more like we're rewarding the players exploring and coming up with decisions on how to do stuff. In some of these areas, I don't plan anything, period. I set up our opponents, our antagonists, or general enemies that's going to attack players on the spot. I set up the environment that they're in. I set up the story of that situation. Why are these guys here? What are they doing? The players walk in. And at that point, my planning ends. I say, okay, you're here. And the players can explore and make their decisions. And what happens ultimately is up to them. Now, in the area they're in right now, the objective is to get out. But there is no easy, obvious, clear-cut way to get out. One of the NPCs has ideas of how to get out, but how the players ultimately, if they decide to listen to her or do stuff that she suggests, or if they do stuff, how they actually reach that resolution, that's up to them. And then depending on how successful it is, really it depends on, like, I look to see ways to test their creativity and how they choose to resolve certain conflicts, how they choose to ignore conflicts, avoid conflicts, stuff like that. You know, how they choose to interact with certain things, particularly since two of the players aren't particularly experienced role players. So I try to come up with sort of like tests for them to challenge them to explore role playing and improve themselves. It's not just about me improving. I'm also trying to find ways to get players more engaged, to feel like they want to get more engaged, to give them opportunities to engage and explore their own abilities and stuff like that. I feel like that's a responsibility.
Oh, destroyed.
So what I was saying was that it's a responsibility of every game developer, every modder, to give players the opportunity to express themselves and explore the gameplay. And that's the biggest failure of StarCraft 2, with all the point and click adventure shit and all the fucking arbitrary time limits and all these gimmicks and shit they add on the map, is the developers are intentionally saying, we want you to play it only the way we would play it, which is we don't have skill, so we don't want skill expression.
Yeah, developer
And we don't
approved
want
strategies, you
player
know what I
expression.
mean?
Yeah. So you're not even playing an RTS in StarCraft 2. You're not even playing a game. You're just playing Simon Says.
Well, just like
And that's like
D&D, I think,
what you want
you
to
can look
avoid.
at RTS games as similar avenues of expression. It's just that most of the time they aren't, like, in practice. But if your objective is to escape an area in D&D, there's so many different ways that you might be able to do that. In fact, there's probably, like, literally limitless ways because of the nature of D&D versus an actual, like, digital game. But in Brood War, if your objective is to destroy all enemy buildings or destroy all enemy production structures or whatever, there's so many different ways that you could go about that. And those choices increase exponentially based on the game state, the tech trees that are tech available, right? The enemies, the allies, the map state, what kind of resources you have at your disposal, how far away expansions are. Like, literally off the top of my head, just list like double-digit things. You can come up with so many different aspects that do make a difference when it comes to actually trying to, make a decision as a player. And that's just like what I can think of off the top of my head. There's so many different things that interact with those decisions that the player can make. And then there's all of the decisions that the player can actually make. And so there's plenty of different ways that players can be creative. It's ways that players can innovate, which is why you see at high level competition in Brood War, so many different strategies happening. And, even amongst the map makers for the melee.
I was just about to say, just look at the fact that the professional scene is still evolving to this day. There's no reason you can't apply that kind of mindset to single player.
Yeah, I mean, after remaster came out, a lot of people went back to try to find new bugs to use to their advantage. And
well, there's definitely some good bugs that people found.
Yeah,
like
like
exploding drones.
Oh yeah, and like the pylon that if you cancel it at the right time, you select a building that's an enemy's.
Yeah, I remember that.
If there's no building to select, you crash. Lovely. Just go for a what they call a 10cc, where you don't build anything for a while, and if your opponent crashes, then you win. Free MMR, dude.
10cc.
Yeah, it's pretty psychotic.
Oh, that's
good. Yeah, that happens. But one of the things that they found out recently is that actually, if you shift, so if you tell a vulture to lay a mine, and then you shift H to tell them to cue the hold position order, as soon as they lay the mine, they can then be ordered to move, or they can then immediately attack. And this is like, very, very epic amounts of action economy that you open up, reduce the opportunity cost of using a vulture, which is already an incredibly cost efficient unit, especially with speed upgrade. The main use that they see is mines, and they see these mine usages, and now you can, basically take advantage of this animation canceling, if you will, that nobody even really widely knew about until after the remasters. Shit like that is still happening in that game, and that's where the hackers or whatever they're not really hackers, but the idea that like you're going in and you're actually trying to experiment with the game to find really weird strategies. Like people found out ways to use spider mines to decollide their vultures so they could get by the 3 pylon walls on Fighting Spirit and stuff. It's like people find all sorts of different ways. I don't know why they all center around fucking vultures, but people find all sorts of ways to abuse the game's engine. And you would call it
because the vulture makes collision on itself, right?
Right. Well, the mine makes collision. Yeah. So that's why they decollide before. Like when you found out the whole position
of breaking games for speedrunning too.
Oh yeah, just finding different ways to decollide and stuff. So it's interesting how that actually levels up the scene instead of people are always like, I hope Blizzard will patch this bug out, and thankfully Blizzard has decided not to make any balance changes to the game, unlike Warcraft 3, where they decided they would ship the StarCraft 2 development team over for a while and have them edit that. Just constantly removing abilities from heroes like lunatics, as if every unit's the infestor now. Okay. So yeah, there's some lunacy. There's some other ends of the spectrum. One of the things that we were talking about on stream today as well is the fact that the fucking mothership core used to be neural parasited. It was the only unit that was ever bothered to be neural parasited by the infestor. And then they gave the mothership the heroic tag and made neural parasite not affect heroic units. It's the only fucking unit in Melee that has the heroic tag. They literally gimmicked the goddamn neural parasite ability off of the only unit it was used for. It's really stupid. So, like, really asinine decisions get made, and it's ways to, like, oh, you're not using this unit the way we wanted you to use it, so we're going to change its ability so it can't be used that way, you fucking piece of shit, you white male. So then you can't really do anything. So it's pretty unfortunate.
Check your usability privilege. Exactly,
dude. Maybe they should just make all units move 50% slower and call it, like, disability rights or something. If your Marines aren't using a wheelchair, are you really progressive?
You got leg privilege, mate.
Leg privilege.
Ableist, yeah.
Mexicant.
That makes Zerglings particularly ableist because they've got like 6 limbs.
I know. They're actually extra because apparently they have, everything that, like, I guess they were supposed to just be appendages or antenna, but apparently those are supposed to be hands that grab onto the target while they nibble on them, even though that's not what it looks like whatsoever.
No, they're fucking scythes. They're stabbing. They're cutting things.
The remaster of Brood War made them hands. Yeah, that's real. I'm not making that up. They remastered it and they turned them into tiny little hands. Little grabbies.
Oh, God, fucking! I gotta try to find the StarCraft manual, the original one.
Yeah, who knows? Imagine if they retconned the manual so they could have grabby hands on the Zerglings. Zerglings just need to wear gloves. That's all.
I know the grabby hands was something I saw somewhere, but I didn't think it was the sprite that had that.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, they obviously retconned all the portrait data when they remastered the portraits to make it so that they were like fucking StarCraft 2 Protoss. So, and Raynor looks like Shepard.
Let's see if it's new or not.
Yeah, let's take a look.
'Cause I swear that old sprite had fucking
Well, it looks like claws because that's what they're smacking into the enemy unit when they attack. So you wouldn't expect it. They're
like
just
their attack
slapping
animation.
them.
Yeah.
Can you imagine all this time Zerglings are just bitch slapping motherfuckers? That's a pretty good unit.
I mean, they retconned a lot of stuff. Yeah, that is it. I'm fucking right. Here, I'll show you. I'll literally fucking show you what I'm looking at right now.
Yeah. I'm never flabbergasted enough by some stuff that comes out of Blizzard.
This is the kind of shit that really pisses me off is when they don't even fucking reference the source material properly.
From their own product. from their own IP.
Product. Look at this. I'm telling you. Oh, it's the forelegs that are a size. Yeah, but like, look at the way they're set up, because they run with their hands, right?
Let's see. Zgashi Dune Runners. Okay, Metzen.
Like the whole fucking thing. Yeah, they've got that flying apostrophe fetish that Metzen has. Like, let's see if I can find the remastered Zergling if it's actually accurate to that. I haven't actually seen the remastered Zergling, so I'm just gonna look for it.
They definitely don't look like hands. They look like pincers, if anything, which I wouldn't imagine, judging by the width of them, they wouldn't actually hold on to anything unless it was like a fly or something. Like they wouldn't hold on to a power armor or a zealot. They would just like incise more, like cut more or something. So yeah, it looks like, from what I'm seeing here anyway, like, their front legs are what they're attacking with. I don't know how they run on that though. That looks very uncomfortable.
I don't remember the animation, but I'm pretty sure they don't run on those. Obviously, StarCraft 2 changed that. StarCraft 2 changes it. They flip the sides of those limbs.
Right. What a mess.
Still
Deep dive.
I think they may have... Oh, this is probably a low resolution image.
Grabbies.
Oh, yeah. So what they did in Remaster is it's... they really like the main thing that makes them look weird is they really brought out the definition of those hands. Now, in the normal sprite, the hands don't really exist. That's why it looks like the tops on them when they're idle is... the
antenna
sides.
or something, yeah.
Well, they look like claws because they have no hand definition at all in that sprite. And when you have the vertical one in particular...
Oh. You?
I know it's a Reddit and Reddit's gross, but...
oh, yeah.
When we look at this image, like, look at the north-facing images. That's why they look so weird. It's because they literally added, like, a second half of the limb. I think those are supposed to be claws, but in the original sprite, those look like the scythes are being held upwards when they're idle. And it looks like their feet are down because when you look at the large render, those scythes are much larger than what is portrayed in the sprite. So the sprite's very different. Furthermore, in the new remastered one, they're much longer. They're way longer. So they look really, really strange. They really busy up the graphic. I actually think this is a case where you probably wanted to deviate from the original a little bit and make the body more beast-like and then make the top hands more like the StarCraft 2 one. Just make them limb scythes like the original one instead of like this. Because like comparing these two sprites, the remastered ones are so much busier looking.
For no real reason either. Like it doesn't add value to it. It just makes it harder to figure out what's going on.
Even their tails. Like look at the fucking left one. The tail facing upwards loses player color. It looks like kind of like a little dildo. And then when you look at the middle one, the whole body structure fucking changes. The thighs totally change. The legs totally change.
They're not dark black for extra easy contrast, so it ends up looking much less defined.
There's no like definition of the legs anymore in the remaster. They just fucking disappear.
Although this does prove, I guess, the fact that these fucking duck-feeted Zerglings actually have well, it's hard to tell that they're duck-feeted in the original sprite, but I didn't know that they were bipedal this whole time. I was sure that they were quadrupedal. StarCraft 2 poisoned my mind.
Well, their running animation doesn't make them look bipedal.
No, it makes them look like they're And I guess they're literally frog hopping their way to fucking to the Nexus or something, the nearest enemy.
Yeah, but that's also like the other thing is now look at the fucking cinematics.
Yeah. There's no consistency across 3 different sources now. And all of them are supposed to be like primary sources from the original developer. So XD.
Yeah, they're all fucking different. So like that you got different fucking canon depending which part of the game is in. But they're really just fucking termagants.
Yeah. Fanfic of a fanfic.
It's just absurd. The ripoffs, the blatant ripoffs. I really like. I hope that one day there is some explanation of the absolute bizarre mystery of what's going on between those companies that prevents Blizzard from just getting a huge burning fist plowed so far up their urethra that they're tasting chili.
Chili? Hoop thrower?
Yeah. Yeah.
Hoop thrower posted a comment about how Age of Empires 3 is a good use of heroes in RTS, so he's banned. His argument basically boiled down to I haven't responded to it yet, but the argument was something to the effect of like, well, they gave you heroes as basically a glorified scout unit, and that's better than everything else in RTS, which is probably true. Like any other time that you have heroes, their purpose morphs the gameplay entirely. So if that's the case, then sure, yeah, you have a scouting unit. Okay, instead of scouting with a worker, you're scouting with a hero unit. It's not that strong. Maybe it applies some bonuses, or you can upgrade it or something. It's probably better integrated than most games, but it's not really well integrated on an objective sense because it's just, why don't you just start out with a fucking scout unit like Age of Empires 2? I don't get it.
Wasn't Age of Empires 3 that really, really janky one?
It's the one that has really like trading cards in it for some reason.
Don't all of them have trading cards in them now if they're on Steam? Because it's like...
Oh, no. That's not what I mean. I mean, in-game, there's a mechanic where you get cards that result in basically like where you are is a homestead of some sort, where you're like a colony and your parent country, be it like the United Kingdom or Spain or something like that, or I guess it would be Great Britain back then, but the Spain, Portugal probably, France. I don't know how many companies were or countries were actually there, but basically they would send you stuff to your town center. And it would just like teleport there like a Nidus canal after a certain amount of time. So it wasn't really immersive, but they sent you stuff basically. And you would use these trading cards based on points that you would get for doing certain actions. So it was like it's like special upgrade points, but you would just use them to either get like extra units or certain research or a certain upgrade. And that's how, like, an extra bit of economy alongside the 4 resources you were already managing, because Age of Empires is a bloated fucking mess. So I don't really know why they decided to do that. It made the game even less approachable for anybody. And when you're already dealing with a game that tries to reinvent so much shit from an RTS perspective, it really didn't make any sense. But yeah, since I think Hoop Thrower listens to these podcasts, there's a little shout out for him, a little twinkle in his eye, because we said his name and Age of Empires 3. So 3.
The only reason anybody start putting heroes in this shit is because fucking
3.
Fucking Command and Conquer had heroes, and then Warcraft 3 did it, yeah. And now it's like, well, Blizzard was successful, so you gotta have heroes in it. You gotta be like Warcraft 3.
Cargo
and
cult.
all the lemmings marched off to the meat grinder.
Mm-hmm. Pretty embarrassing if you think about it.
Well, that's just insanity.
So what do we have as far as like a wrap up for this particular topic anyway? We talked a lot about decisions you make before and after project development, and how you continue to make good decisions, and sort of like what might lead you to make certain decisions over others. There's certainly a lot to be taken away from this particular episode. It's a nice way to sort of demystify how we got to this position. One thing I guess I'll close on in general is like a closing thought, is relatively connected to everything else, but not something that we talked about overtly, is the idea that, like you said, failure is way more valuable than success because you learn what you did wrong so you can do something right. If at some point you earn your success, but if you get unearned success by fluking your way to the top, or it's like a fake success where you think it's success because everybody tells you, oh yeah, this is great, I really like Zerg Campaign Easy, then you're going to be for a world of pain when you start to realize, oh wait, this isn't actually good. And then you've got to do a bunch of unlearning, and it's super damaging to the learning process. So that's why you want to fail initially, and you want to be open to that failure, because failure means there's a blueprint to what you can do to improve. Now you just have to do something that gives you a different result, or you have to analyze your result and how you got there and what led there. Like there's a bunch of different things that you can do. It's like when you find a flaw, that's actually very motivating for me anyway, because while it does mean that there's more work, on the other hand, it's like, oh, I can actually fix this. Like I know that I have what it takes to resolve the issue. And so that can be really, really positive actually, even though at face value, you wouldn't think it. So that leads to a whole different conversation, but failure being your primary example for learning, as well as obviously learning from other people's failures and other people's mistakes and other people's experience. That's what gets you the experience that you otherwise associate with successful people. And what I mean by that is a lot of people down the years will basically associate, like even somebody as mundane as myself, or somebody as much, much more greater than I am in terms of how successful they've been or how prolific they've been in their respective fields. Like I often reference Thorin, the esports historian, because that guy is my own inspiration, and he does a lot of really, really high quality content, but he's very prolific. He does a lot of content, and he doesn't let the quality of his content slip despite the quantity that he's doing. That's something that I view as very inspirational and something that I want to reach for myself. But I recognize that him and I have a similar process. Like the way that I'm getting to the point that I am in terms of how skilled I am and how refined my process is it's not through a different way than he did it, really. It's like the way that we got to where we all are is very similar. So the both of us share that in that sense, even though like obviously he doesn't really know who I am. I think I've been on a couple of talk shows with him before as a producer, but nothing crazy. So it's not like we've sat down and really talked about this stuff. It's just that he's worked to demystify his own success. He even has a video on his own YouTube channel that says, demystify your success. Like tries to talk about why he thinks this is valuable and stuff, because a lot of people wrongfully assume that they not only can they not do, X or Y. Oh, I can't get into programming. Oh, I don't know anything about assembly. Oh, I can't really do, like, I shouldn't really bother with melee maps or whatever because they're not really that useful. All this stuff that, like, I held these preconceived notions that ended up being false. And these things that, actually made me weaker as a person and weaker as a developer because I just never bothered to pursue these things. The idea is if you see somebody who's good at that stuff, you assume it's like a natural talent that fueled their ability to get there. And so you just basically assume that like, oh, because I don't have that natural talent, because if I did, I would have manifested by now. That's just out of my reach. That's something that I can't do. And you assume that there's like this curtain drawn behind like, whatever their success actually is, whatever the success of whoever you're looking at actually is. You look at somebody who's really prolific or who's, producing high quality content, you just assume you'd never get to the same position. But if you've already started to grow and learn and critically analyze and try to figure out where you can improve, that is the exact process by which all of these people, myself, Thorin, et cetera, have gotten to the points that they are at, and where they will continue to draw upon fuel to improve further and get even higher levels than they already are at. And that's like a big deal. That's part of the daily grind, or the consistent element of it all, is the idea that you're always looking at stuff. Like you said, at the end of your D&D games, you're always looking back at the footage that you've compiled, that other people have compiled, and try to figure out what went wrong here, what went right here. How do I maximize the positive, minimize the negative? What do I need to change about my pipeline or my style of deploying this content? What things can I improve upon, and what things are higher quality or higher priority, and then what things are less on the more on the back burner, but I should still note down for the future when I have a bit more free time or motivation to do that, lower hanging fruit, as it were. And that's one of those things that I think really does underscore a lot of the conversations that we've had on this podcast, especially on this particular episode. The idea that you're constantly going to be working on stuff. It is rather mundane at the end of the day. It feels like it should be much more magnanimous. It feels like it should be much more magnificent. It feels like you should be able to say, oh, this is the turning point. This is how you get more productive. This is how you get better at content production. But it's very mundane. It's like practice and constant man hours devoted into stuff, and it's consistency, and it's making sure that you can do that without like hurting yourself in a physical sense, or overextending yourself in a more emotional or a motivational sense. It's basically just like all the mundane trappings of everyday life, but as it pertains to content production. So figuring out a way to separate your own presuppositions of successful people or successful products and the development process that led to the creation of those products is going to really go a long way to motivate you, because you realize, oh, this is within my reach. This is within everybody's reach as long as they want to apply themselves. It removes the sort of pedestal that these people can sometimes stand on or try to stand on, or get put on by other people in some cases, even willing or not. But it does allow you to get on that pedestal yourself in that sense. In theory, it levels the playing field, because you realize that even if there was some natural talent that turned somebody into the machine of content production that they are right now, or got them down to the halfway to the finish line or something, they still had to do a lot of the work themselves. They still had to do all of the practice and all of the failure and all of the learning themselves. A lot of it was still required. And maybe in some cases, like we were arguing earlier, if they did fluke their way to some early success, it was very fleeting, even if it was because of their talent. And sometimes it might have even set them back, because they had to learn how to do it properly from the get-go without relying on what they are already good at before they really get started in whatever realm or field that they're trying to work within. So it's a big topic, obviously, to close on in theory, but demystifying one's success, demystifying everybody else's success is very healthy for you, because it stops you, in my opinion, from getting too much in your head about stuff. It helps reinforce the confidence that we underscored was important earlier in this particular episode, based on the fact that you need to be able to make decisions in a somewhat timely manner, so that you don't demotivate yourself by definition, by constantly languishing in the same shit, basically. By also making sure that you make a decision. If there is a time gate for whatever reason, if there is a time crunch in some capacity, you can make that decision in a relatively easy manner. You can decide whether or not it's time to double down, whether or not it's time to take a step back for a moment and reanalyze. And you can do so without dragging things on, dragging your feet, dragging ass, dragging breath. I ran out of drags, but
like a dog dragging its ass across the floor. Yeah.
Yeah, that happens all the time here. Better watch out. Talk shit, get hit. So yeah, I don't know. That's where we're at right now. I don't know what you have to say on all that and everything else we talked about.
I don't believe in talent at all, actually. I do not believe that somebody is born with an innate skill, because that doesn't make any sense. I think that what people are born with is sort of like innate tendencies and an ability to acclimate very well with certain learning mechanisms. I think that some people find certain ways of processing information much better than others. That is definitely true. And that ultimately means that they can pick up skills much easier than other people can. Like, like an autistic savant might be really good at understanding numbers. He wasn't born, being Asian and being a member of God's people and knowing math and everything, but he picked it up really, really easily. There's an ability with him to pick up logic and determine math and stuff like that. It doesn't make him smart. That just means he's really, really good at processing certain information. And I've watched that a lot. I've watched a lot of people pick up skills like modeling and programming and stuff like that. And in a year, they're a fucking top tier. They're some of the best of the best of the best. But that didn't mean that they were actually good. They were people who lacked creative aspirations. They were people who would then squander their skills. They would then, end up dripping off to, mediocrity. A lot of the times they even end up abandoning the skill entirely. Meanwhile, I have learning disabilities. I've struggled for years and years. You wouldn't know, looking at my content, that I've been dealing with 3D modeling since 2001. You wouldn't know that I composed music from 2000 to 2006. You wouldn't know I've been doing voice acting for over 25 years. You wouldn't know that I've been in this shit for over, in digital content creation for over 20 years. But I have been. And hi, you're a cat and you're knocking stuff over. You wouldn't know, that I've been in this shit for so long, because I haven't been able to learn that much. My skills don't reflect the time invested. And that can be really demoralizing. And there's a lot of people I've talked with over the years who are extremes on either side of the fence. They pick up a skill, they learn it real easy, and then they end up dropping it. And I ask, why would you drop it? You're so good. I know people who picked up music that I would fucking kill to have skills like what they had when they quit 15, 16 years ago. And people who, a couple months into picking up 3ds Max, I would kill to have their skills today. And all these people end up drifting in the way, and they don't do anything. It's a weird polarity. It's something for another cast, but it's one of those things where, like, that can be really demoralizing. That can really kill your drive to work on a project. So in a lot of cases, especially when you're starting off, I have one piece of recommendation. Don't look at other people's work. Don't expose yourself. Don't look on fucking... Okay, please expose yourself. It's very lewd. But don't expose yourself to other people's shit. It's going to demoralize you. If you fucking pick up drawing and you start looking at other people's shit on fucking DeviantArt, ArtStation, any given fucking furry website, fucking Yandex, any of this shit, you're going to be demoralized. You are going to be demoralized. And there's two faces for that. First of all, you're not looking at the time investment. Second of all, you don't know all the tricks of the trade. A lot of the shit that people do, it's not nearly as complicated as it actually looks. And you don't know that yet because you're not experienced with it. And it's going to hit hard and it's going to demoralize you. I watch it every fucking day in Discord whenever anybody posts something about art and then you end up, or somebody posts someone else's art or something like that. And somebody will be like, oh, I wish I could do that. That's poisonous. That's a dangerous line of thinking. I always think like that because I'm constantly exposed to this stuff, whether or not I want to. And I've been exposed to it for decades. But when you're just starting off, it's going to hit. And everybody learns things at a different pace. And chances are, in my experience, the vast majority of people who are really interested in getting into this stuff, they're going to have problems learning. You're going to have getting into this. So when you're just starting out, don't worry too much about risk assessing and stuff like that. Start worrying about that once you've actually got your feet grounded, once you've actually got an idea of what's going on. Then at that point, then you start thinking about how you're going to apply what you do know, how you're going to be able to grow what you know, what is biting off too much to chew, or what is good room for growth, what can be used to explore your growth, but also what is something you can actually be confident enough with. When you're just starting off, you don't worry about that shit. Mediate what it is, manage your expectations, but don't be afraid to walk in and get completely fucking overwhelmed, because it's probably going to happen, and you're probably going to end up canning a lot of fucking projects before you end up really figuring out what is actually getting my feet wet, and then what is losing my feet entirely, what is accidentally tumbling into the fucking wood chipper. So don't worry about those distinctions when you start off, but manage your expectations and figure out what it is you actually want to accomplish with what time you do have, and think about that from your learning perspective. And you probably wouldn't have that perspective until you get involved with it. It's probably going to take a long time to figure out, but if you're really into it, if you really want to get into it, that's stuff you're going to have to contend with either way, so you don't need to rush it.
Definitely no Russians allowed. See ya, UED Commander.
Damn goblins.
I don't think there's a better way to end the podcast than that. So thanks once again for joining me, Mesk. And we'll be back probably next week. Coffee. Enjoy your coffee. Enjoy your cock, viewer, because it's ours. And I'll see you guys later. Bye.
Smoke weed!